I remain a bit agnostic about whether there is a so-called hard problem of consciousness or not. People like Francis Crick would say, let's put philosophy aside for a bit. Let's just look for correlations between what happens in brains and what happens in consciousness. But of course, correlations are not explanations and don't indicate causation either. Instead of just looking for correlations, let's look for explanatory mapping. It pays to kind of chip away at them a little bit separately and to treat consciousness not as one big scary mystery calling for one eureka moment of a solution, but as a set of connected properties. We should not take intelligence as a benchmark or a criterion for whether something is conscious or not. That's much more a reflection of our own anthropocentric bias. In many ways, the whole debate about whether AI can be conscious is a huge distraction because nobody knows. It's worth worrying about a little bit because its consequences, were it to happen, would be very bad. But we will have brought into the universe things which have moral considerability, and that is a huge problem.
Done such a wonderful job of sort of defining the field of a science of consciousness. And I think that is something that's in the making. I mean, and I think this is sort of particularly apropos for what we're trying to do in this website. And that is that we have a sort of an agenda, we have a point of view. And what we're trying to do is say, is there a scientific consensus around what consciousness is, what intelligence is, what are the different fields, what are the different points of view, what's the evidence, what's the convergence, what's the divergence. And I think in a larger context, we're making a transition in society from being organized on the sort of Newtonian, the metaphor Newtonian mechanics of being sort of a principle of industrialization. It's been informed our economics, it's really defined the West in the sense of the machine, the material machine, objective reality, common sense reality. Science is a form of reductive and explanation within a material explanation. All that is sort of characterized the West. And now where I think, and be interested in your thoughts on this would be sort of a theme going through this, is that we're transitioning to a new way of conceiving of reality and the technologies that define us. That are basically influenced by computational neuroscience, cognitive sciences, biology, and also the quantum mechanics and quantum information theory. And so we're really saying what is coming about, what do we know, what we don't know, where are the things that there's sort of strong agreement, and where are the things that need to be approved. And so what I can do is would introduce you. You're a professor of cognitive and neuroscience at Sussex, and you run a center there, and you've been doing this for a number of years. I mean, one thing that we do have in common in a certain age span, as you mentioned, your interest in Dan Dennett and Gerald Edelman. Well, when I was working on my PhD at finishing up at the MIT AI lab, and this is way back, and we were having a conference we wanted to have a philosopher involved, and the National Science Foundation said, well, why don't we get Dan Dennett? And so I went over to Tufts and I met with him and said, this thing called artificial intelligence you'd be interested in. And I was working on a distributed cognition model and he was interested. He said, oh, that's a homunculus. I've been thinking about these things. And then, so I was interested in how do you explain psychoanalytic transcripts that seem to have multiple selves interfering with one another, and say, well, how do you explain that? It's not a single generative model. So we had a distributed model, and Dan was very helpful in that. And then from that, we met with Jerry Edelman and some of his work on neurodarwinism. This is like 50 years ago, I must say. So that went dormant for quite a while. And now all these things are now surfacing, and we're seeing and converging is a new kind of science. And I think that what that is and what we can build upon becomes really important. So what I'd like to do is if you could sort of summarize sort of what you think and the key points of your research. You do this very well in your book, and you lay out how your thinking progressed and you looked very hard at integrated information theory, and the basic measurements of consciousness and what constitute consciousness. So you could walk us a bit through that and highlight those transitions, and then what you think is going. What do you think are the things that need to be proven? What are the points of contention and what are the points of consensus, and what kinds of experiments that you would like to see. And I in turn am interested in sort of tying your thinking back to some of the points that Chris Fields and his work that he did, and he and Don Hoffman did this piece on conscious agents that I'm familiar with, and then also some of the Carl's work. And so where these different pieces fit together, and what you would, so you have a research center, and you're actually doing experiments now in augmented and virtual reality, and you're developing a scientific platform. So where do we expect things to go, and have a first principle understanding? I mean, it does, you make a distinction between consciousness and intelligence, which I think is a really important one. And then you also align consciousness with life, and that's not, so that's very similar, I think, to Carl's position on the predictive brain thing. To be alive is make predictions. So I'll set that, let you run from there, but and take it where you will.
Okay, thank you, John. Well, I'm not going to try to address all of those points in one go. I think that that might be a bit too much. But maybe I'll start with the overall framework. And you're right, so I've been directing or co-directing this Sussex Centre for Consciousness Science since about 2009, and actually worked with Gerald Edelman before that in San Diego in California. And the approach I like to take to better understanding consciousness has been evolving over the years, and it's crystallizing into something which I've been calling the real problem of consciousness. And it's not really that new. It's got many ancestors, like neurophenomenology from Francisco Varela and so on, and David Chalmers talks about his mapping problem. But the key point that I think I want to emphasize here is that I remain a bit agnostic about whether there is a so-called hard problem of consciousness or not. It seems as if there is. David Chalmers calls this the meta problem. Why do we think there's a hard problem of consciousness? It seems as though consciousness, by which I use the Thomas Nagel definition of, for a conscious organism, there is something it is like to be that organism. So any kind of experience whatsoever. So the hard problem, how do we understand this relationship between experience and matter, between body and mind? And instead of trying to address that head on, I prefer to chip away at it. And of course, this was always the historical strategy, at least from the days when the science of consciousness began to take hold in the mind and brain sciences. People like Francis Crick would say, let's put philosophy aside for a bit. Let's just look for correlations between what happens in brains and what happens in consciousness. And that's fantastic. And a lot of great work has come out from that. But of course, correlations are not explanations and don't indicate causation either. So you have to go further. And I think it's possible to go further while still not putting philosophy aside completely, but also not trying to do metaphysics with physics or with neuroscience. There is consciousness. I think our questions about it, our conception of the kind of thing or process consciousness is may well change. But our starting point is that there are such things as conscious experiences or such processes. And we know they're intimately related to the brain. Instead of just looking for correlations, let's look for explanatory mappings. Let's try and understand how and why particular kinds of brain activity or brain-body processes should go along with this or that kind of conscious experience. And computational models and theories of various kinds can provide the tools to do this, that give us some intuition that's more than brute correlation, that says, oh yeah, I see, that kind of brain process that maps in a rich way between phenomenology and mechanism. And in my work, this has kind of fallen out relatively by accident in three different domains. One would be conscious level, how conscious you are at any time, sleep anesthesia, so on. Another would be conscious content, when you are conscious, the contents of your conscious experience at that moment, the world around you, colors, shapes, people, places. And then finally, really strictly a subset of that, but I think a distinctive one deserving separate emphasis, is conscious self, the experience of being me or being you, as I use for the title of the book. And these are not ontologically independent of each other, but I think heuristically it pays to kind of chip away at them a little bit separately and to treat consciousness not as one big scary mystery calling for one eureka moment of a solution, but as a set of connected properties. And the historical analogy here is, of course, how people investigated life. And I don't want to overplay this analogy because sometimes I get criticized for it. I use it mainly in a historical sense, that at one point life seemed very mysterious, and people who describe themselves as vitalists thought that they would need some new principle, some spark of life in order to explain the difference between the living and the non-living. And that didn't come to pass. And although we don't understand everything about life, there's no longer this sense of conceptual mystery that life is indeed a property of physics and chemistry. And part of the strategy for that was to, again, treat life not as a single big scary mystery, and like, what is the spark of life, but as a collection of related properties. Now, there are many differences. Consciousness seems to be a different kind of thing. People will say life is still a functional property of what things do. The analogy is definitely not perfect. Many differences between life and consciousness. But historically, it just tells us that the fact that things seem mysterious now, with the tools and the concepts we have now, does not mean they'll always be mysterious. And the way to make them less mysterious, I think, is to follow this real problem chipping away approach, but chipping away in a way that is trying to build explanation, not just brute correlation. So that's the broad approach. And then in conscious level, this pans out with measures of things like integrated information, complexity, causal density, emergence, again, without making the strong claim that these things are identical to consciousness, but just because they provide these homologies between what's happening in dynamics and what's happening in experience. And this is why I first went to San Diego in 2001, because these ideas that measures of complexity that Gerald Edelman and Giulio Tononi came up with, it was the first time I'd seen anything like that. And I thought, that's wonderful. And you can do that without buying into the full ambition of integrated information theory, which is trying to address the hard problem head on. And then the other broad framework that I appeal to is the predictive brain and predictive processing, which of course itself has a very rich history in machine learning, in psychology, in philosophy, and provides the resources for understanding the nature of conscious content as the content of the brain's best Bayesian guess about the causes of its sensory information. So we can model in computational models and test in experiments things about this process. Again, trying to build richer bridges between mechanism and experience. And then finally, and then I'll pass it back to you, is conscious self. And this is being a subset of conscious content. And one insight here is that the self is not the thing that does the perceiving. The self is another kind of perception. And the experience of being a distinct self is part of that perceptual construction. And trying to understand the nature of the self, which itself has many different parts: body, emotion, thought, belief, memory, and so on. And the long game for me is all of these things, I think, will be well explained in terms of the nature of the phenomenology, in terms of specific kinds of brain-based predictions. But the thing that I focus on at the moment is that pulling on this thread suggests a very intimate connection between consciousness and life. And this was not a place I planned to get to, but it's a place that I ended up. That if you start thinking about why the brain seems to work like this, as something that is where this common principle of prediction error minimization is so naturally applied in so many domains. Well, why? Well, because that provides a good way of physiological regulation, maintaining homeostasis or allostasis. This is where it begins to make contact with Carl Friston's free energy principle, because you have these two things that meet in the middle. You can either go from like the inside out. I think he calls it the low road. Thinking about perceptual inference of the world, and from there uncovering this deep imperative to stay alive down to the level of individual cells. Or you can start from the free energy principle and ask for things that exist to keep on existing and to maintain themselves against dissolution into disorder, what kinds of processes must these things embody or enact? And then you can sort of work your way out from the basic constraints for living systems, which are very different from computers. Living systems are autopoietic. They regenerate their own components. They don't just do things. And you can then recover the whole edifice of predictive processing this way. So this has led me to a philosophical view which is broadly materialist. I have this broad view that, at least pragmatically, we're going to make the most progress by trying to understand the properties of consciousness in terms of dynamics, mechanisms, mathematical models of physical, chemical, biological processes. But it's also a little bit biological naturalist, which is a bit more of a minority view. And biological naturalism term was coined by John Searle back in the early 80s, I think. And this is the idea that consciousness is a property of living systems, so that only, but not all, living systems are conscious. Of course, this raises the question about what do we mean by a living system? And I don't want to be carbon chauvinist about this. I think there's a multiple realizability that might pertain to living systems too. But a computer, at least the kinds of computers we have now, are not living systems by that stretch of the word, which brings us to the present day. And I'm increasingly involved in the discourse around whether AI can be conscious. And I think that debate is confused in all sorts of ways. You do not need to believe or even tend towards biological naturalism to see the weaknesses of the arguments that assume AI is on the verge of consciousness. But if you do, it gives you another reason to suspect that might be where we're going.
You talk about the rapture, the technological rapture underlying a lot of this machine consciousness concept, and I couldn't agree with you more. It's not a living thing. It doesn't. I guess one of the things that made me really resonate with what Carl has done, and I've been interested in this whole field of self-organizing systems and cybernetics, and from college, doing my work. And there's this notion of the law of requisite variety. I don't know if you're familiar with the good regulator theorem, is that something that's alive is able to differentiate itself from something outside itself, and it has a definition of itself that is able to create a mapping and maintain a difference by having a representation, a model. And that sort of the biological things, in a sense, represent a kind of a representation of a niche that is able to be coherently be itself in some sense. And I guess one of the things that at least I'm seeing in Carl's discussion, and also with Michael Levin and Chris Fields, they seem to be of a common mind, is that you look at cells and you can see this ability to differentiate itself, create a model of the world it's in, it's a Markov blanket that you have, and there are also notions of Markov kernels. I think is sort of interesting, the variant of that you see that Don Hoffman has. But that is more and that they come together to form more complex. They aggregate into greater complexity, and then there's sort of that. So each has their own kind of sense definition of self, but then they can form higher levels of organization and complexity, and that's what biology is about versus any kind of sort of mechanical physics. I mean, is that consistent with your thinking, or is it? What would you edit that?
To be very honest, how exactly concepts like Markov blankets and so on feature in what I'm doing is still an evolving story. I first encountered the free energy principle in 2007 and spent years with my colleagues, and especially Chris Buckley, a good colleague of mine, writing the first mathematical review of free energy principle that wasn't from Carl's group, and to try to understand what it was all about. And that didn't even involve Markov blankets at that point. That was more the core idea of variational free energy minimization and active inference. So these concepts are very interesting, and you mentioned also the cybernetic concepts. And I remember writing a paper on the law of requisite variety as part of my PhD in the 90s in a totally different context. And these things come back. And one of the great, I think, stroke of luck for me was doing my master's and PhD where I am now at Sussex, because in the 90s, the intellectual atmosphere here was very kind of countercultural. It was very resistant to the dominant computationalism, representationalism, perhaps too much, but it certainly equipped me at the time with a sort of skepticism for the dominant narrative, but also, and I think more equally important, a set of tools, practical and conceptual tools for thinking about alternatives, and an awareness of the history of these ideas in mid-20th century cybernetics and Ross Ashby's law of requisite variety and ultra stability, and all of these things were there and kind of in the back of my mind since like 1995, and that's been, I think, just great luck, because not many people had that kind of PhD education. Of course, it meant there were a lot of useful things I didn't learn. So
that's how I was brought up.
Completely.
I was a TA I'm teaching his book, and I did my master's thesis on a computer simulation of what I call neural organisms and the law of requisite variety. This is 1968. This is 1968, but it was way off. It was not mainstream, and that did not translate into what was predominantly AI and symbolic computing and stuff. But it was. I mean, his stuff was so elegant and it was so rigorous, and it just always stayed with me. And now I see some of these basic ideas keep surfacing, and his notion of self-organization. But I guess what I get back to is when you talk about what it means to be a conscious agent and be able to differentiate yourself and have your own representation and be able to create your own sources of energy and then replicate around that. That's certainly not what we have right now in quote artificial intelligence. And I think the conversation about AGI and all that is just totally skewed. But in your research agenda, I mean, where would you see, if you're going to talk about a conscious agent, what are the things you would have to see in order for that to be true?
That's a very good question. And with my colleagues in the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research program, which I've been part of for a long time, we've just written a review, an opinion paper about tests for consciousness, which is kind of trying to address that question. So what criteria would need to be satisfied in order to attribute consciousness to a system? And what's interesting, of course, we didn't come up with answers because we don't have answers yet. But what's interesting is that different domains seem to invite different kinds of answers, and that may be reflective on our own biases. So what we need to see in a human patient with brain damage is very different from what we might take as sufficient in an AI system or in a cerebral organoid or in a non-human animal. So the short answer is, I don't know. I don't have a general set of sufficiency conditions that can be used to make the claim that, yes, X is conscious. I always think it's going to be itself a kind of inference based on the overall similarity between what we think our best idea of what's going on in what the fundamental generative mechanisms for consciousness are in the human brain and what we see elsewhere. But that's a really evolving story. And how to finesse that story, I think it's useful to return to something like the free energy principle and cybernetics, because I think some notes of caution are also advisable. Just as many people rush too quickly to associate computation and information processing with consciousness, I don't want to make the same mistake twice. And we have a bunch of concepts now like Markov blankets and autopoiesis, and they're not exactly the same, and they kind of get lumped together. Then there's a very tricky challenge of how exactly do we think about the relationship between the variational free energy, which started off as a trick in machine learning to be able to turn tricky problems into tractable optimization problems by having an approximate distribution for the posterior and optimizing the parameters of that. There's a machine learning thing. How does that really relate to sort of thermodynamic free energy that one can think about in the context of metabolism? There are ways to connect them, but as far as I can see, and I don't think I have seen as far as is possible here. I think I'm still learning about this area. There are ways to connect informational free energy to thermodynamic free energy, but it's complicated, and it's certainly not trivial to say they're the same thing. You've got Jasinski's equality, you've got the Landau, and all this stuff, but one doesn't want to move too quickly and say, yes, in virtue of the fact that we can use variational free energy to do approximate Bayesian inference, therefore all life is doing predictive processing, I think is wrong. It's an overstatement.
Is it wrong, or is it just an overstatement? Or is
it's certainly not obviously right.
No.
So it needs further justification.
Some people believe that. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. So I just want to be cautious about that. And the other note of caution is what we mean when we say a system has a Markov blanket or is minimizing free energy. Is this an epistemic stance? Is that something that we say is a useful description of what a system is doing? Or is the system, in some more ontological sense, implementing a generative model? It's the difference colloquially between being a model or being describable as a model and having a model. So the system itself is making use of that model. And I think the analogy that makes this clear is another paper that I read as a PhD student in the 90s was Timothy Van Gelder's beautiful paper about the computational Watt governor. This kind of simple mechanism that controlled the pressure in a steam engine, just two steel balls that would rotate. And when the steam pressure rose in the engine, the two balls, the angles would kind of increase, and so there'd be more pressure down on the valve. So it was a very just well-designed feedback mechanism for equalizing the pressure in the steam engine. So you can, of course, describe this computationally, but if you were to build a computational Watt governor that was measuring the pressure through some pressure sensor thing and figuring out how much to elevate, that it'd just be stupid. It'd be a stupid way to do it. It just works. So it is a model, it doesn't have a model. And I think this might be an important difference in helping us resist over-application of things like free energy principle. It is a principle. It can be applied almost to everything. That's one of the beauties of it, but it's also the danger. But it's going to not apply in the same way to everything. There's going to be, or at least my working hypothesis, there's a big difference between, say, a complicated human brain, which probably at some level does encode generative models of things. It doesn't just be describable in that way. That's another area. So I think those are three areas where a deeper understanding is needed, or at least certainly I need to understand better. Perhaps other people already have, like Carl or Michael or others. But for me, I feel these are areas where the simple overall narrative that I started with is a little sketchy.
When you were talking about integrated information theory and the whole idea of information and integration, and there's been attempts to apply that as it's hit certain walls, but there seems to be a way of describing different levels of, and I guess I'd ask you to make a distinction between levels of consciousness or intelligence or complexity. What's the, because you make that distinction, and you can have intelligence, but you don't necessarily have consciousness, and therefore consciousness may be tied to some kind of biology or not. I mean, I'm interested in sort of.
I don't think there's not a therefore there. I think the distinction between consciousness and intelligence certainly stops us taking intelligence as an indication, a test for consciousness, but it doesn't by itself justify biological naturalism. They are two different things. This is not a new distinction. Lots of people have just noted that being intelligent and being conscious are not the same thing. It's not obvious how or if they are correlated. One of the reasons I favor the definition of consciousness from Thomas Nagel is that it explicitly does not refer to cognition or anything that might be conflated with intelligence. It is just about experience. It doesn't say that there has to be information sharing, doesn't say there has to be metacognitive processes as in higher order thought theory. It doesn't say anything. It's just saying there is the fact that for a conscious system experiencing is happening.
Is it totally phenomenological in that sense, the way you're describing? I mean, is it a phenomenological category in that sense? Irreducible.
So Ned Block, yeah, I mean Ned Block likes this. There is this distinction between phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness. Phenomenal conscious being the redness of red, and access consciousness being the fact that this experience of redness is available to other cognitive processes in the brain, such as my ability to say that whatever it is red. People are arguing whether this is a meaningful distinction, and will continue to argue about this, I think, for a long time. Nagel does not explicitly refer to this, but yes, I mean, he's certainly often read as implying that and saying, look, consciousness just is experience. It's not saying there have to be these other things layered on top of it. Now, it may be that in practice there are other things that have to be layered on top of it. It could be that the correct theory of consciousness necessarily involves some cognitive action. But you can still define the explanatory target without reference to its solution. So if you separate consciousness and intelligence in your mind and just realize that, yeah, I mean, I can have a simple conscious experience of being in pain or being hungry, and having that experience and the organism relevance of that experience, the system-wide relevance of that experience, doesn't really have much to do with how intelligent I am as an organism. Then you can start to think about other animals too. Like maybe it depends what the function of consciousness is. It may involve some limited amount of cognition in the sense that conscious experience is useful if they allow flexible behavior and so on. But it is just not the same thing as intelligence. So, we can imagine systems that are intelligent in the sense of doing the right thing at the right time, but are not conscious. And we can imagine the opposite. Take a future cerebral organoid that now it's made out of the same stuff of us. Its dynamics are very similar. Have a hi-fi or whatever we want, but it doesn't do anything. So it's not intelligent, but it might be conscious. So I think at least in principle, these two things are highly dissociable. They may not be strictly orthogonal. But it certainly means we should not take intelligence as a benchmark or a criterion for whether something is conscious or not. That's much more a reflection of our own anthropocentric bias, where we think we are intelligent, we know we're conscious, so we put them together. It's a reflection of that rather than what is likely to be the case.
I mean, my experience in artificial intelligence going way back was, intelligent artifacts, and it was always associated with a set of tasks. Where they started out with checkers and chess to go to one. It was defined by certain tasks that with a level of competence. But I think you could play back to what I think you're saying about consciousness is that there is a sense of a coherent self that is an experience that experiences everything as some unity that may be unique from other unities. Is that what
I think that might even be optional. I mean, there are really interesting, I think, phenomenological open questions about what the space of possible human experiences is. Olaf Blanke and Thomas Metzinger talk about minimal phenomenal selfhood. What does that consist in? Is that necessarily an experience of being distinct from others? People in deep states of flow or meditation or psychedelics may not experience that distinction from others. And again, this doesn't mean that consciousness somehow becomes collective and spread out. All this is a claim about what's the variation in phenomenological space for something like the experience of a self. And it's hard to say what single feature is always there. And my hypothesis for this, and it's just a hypothesis, is that the bedrock of any experience of a self is not personal identity, it's not body ownership, it's not agency or free will. It's this core feeling of being alive, which is extremely difficult to describe, and I can't really describe it very well. But
Yeah, no, it's being. Yeah, it's being. That. Well, now there are. I don't know if you're familiar with some of the work that Donald Hoffman did on traces of consciousness. Are you familiar with that work that he's and then the formalisms that he's working on? As an attempt to develop a formal mathematical representation of using Markov kernels and I guess he's worked with Chris Fields on some of these other ideas of conscious agents. I mean, what kind of tests? I remember repeating an earlier question, but what kind of things would have to happen in order for you to say, well, yeah, that actually that's a conscious agent, or that's not. And in terms of what they're claiming or what they're trying to do right now, is it? Does it have evidentiary standing? I mean, they would claim that yes, you have to. There are tests that need to be done, but I just again getting back to this idea of building things that are sentient or conscious and real efforts to do that they're performing certain tasks. They have generative models. They can upgrade their models. They can have a way of modeling the world, their interactions with others. There's a lot of work that's now being done in computer simulation and modeling that way. And what threshold or what set of things with conditions that you would give it the moniker of, oh, okay, that's a conscious agent. Or it's an unanswerable question in that sense.
Yeah, it's currently unanswerable. I think anyone who claims to have a definitive answer about that is probably mistaken. We just don't have a consensus set of sufficient conditions. So my own thinking, as we were talking about, has led to the idea that life is necessary, and so however whatever the richness of a generative model that an agent might have, however many tasks it's doing, if it's running on a von Neumann style computer, well, it's at best a simulation of a conscious thing. But I might be wrong. I don't know. Nobody knows. But it doesn't mean that anything goes either. I mean, I think some ideas have more credence than others, and I tend to think this link between life and consciousness has some credibility, but it's certainly not sufficient to make determinate statements about sufficiency. And the same goes, I think, for every other theory. And I think what's useful, and some other people in the field, this is this very much discussed preprint by Patrick Butlin and Robert Long and many colleagues, who take the view that, okay, look, we don't know what the sufficient conditions are for consciousness, but in the case of AI, let's at least take the main theories of consciousness and see to what extent the core features of these theories are present in AI systems or could be present in future AI systems. Now, that's useful, but they, of course, and hats off to them, at the beginning of the paper, they explicitly acknowledge that the assumption underlying all of this is that computation is sufficient for consciousness. There's this assumption of computational functionalism, which is an assumption that I think is probably wrong, and IIT says is wrong, and as well. So you can do this, but it's still what we're doing is, I think, a very valuable exercise of gradually uncovering the contours of the landscape. But that's it. And if anyone says that, X is conscious, and the ways in which we're going to have to make these decisions is therefore, not going to be just given by a particular measure or a particular analysis. It's going to be a decision that depends on our biases. It's going to be a decision that depends on the consequences of being right or wrong in different cases. So if we're talking about a person with brain injury, we might want to err on the side of assuming conscious rather than non-conscious because, the consequences of being wrong are large, and we have maybe more priors to think, well, they're more similar to us. But we might be in the opposite place with something like a language model.
Well, you raised a really interesting point about that consciousness is not computational. And this raises the recent work by findings that Roger Penrose and Stuart Habermas and this. I don't know if you're familiar with this paper. This came out about tryptophan, and basically saying that they're microtubules that are able to induce or sufficiently sustain a super resonance that you can actually have quantum computation at the temperature of the brain, and that's a pretty disruptive idea. And saying it's not only this that the computation is cellular, it's not just the neurons, and there's microtubules are everywhere. And there seems to be, and it was, you've done it with anesthesiologists who basically say, when do people become conscious, and how do you turn the awareness of being on and off? And there seem to be these particular kind of gases, exon gases, that affect these microtubules, and it ties into this. There seems to be this kind of evidence, and I just. What's your take on those results in that paper and that was it called orchestrated objective reductionism and I know it was dismissed quite a while ago, but now it seems to be there seems to be some experimental evidence that would validate that.
Well, I think there's a risk of mixing up many things here, which need to be separated out a little bit. So on the one hand, I think it's probably worth stating that Stuart often criticizes me for sort of defending a cartoon neuron approach to consciousness, and I'd just like to say that I don't think that's a really fair criticism. I mean, the whole point of these biological naturalism ideas and the free energy principle and autopoiesis and things like that is that these are not cartoon neurons. Living systems are very distinct kinds of things, and the relevant processes, physics, chemistry, go well beyond a sort of cartoon caricature deep neural network where neuron is just a transfer function and some inputs and some outputs. But what is the relevance of these new findings and these quite old, in some ways, old ideas like orchestrated reduction is quite old, and Penrose has been writing about this stuff for a while. So the one thing I want to say at the beginning is that the reasons I'm suspicious about computational functionalism, the claim that computation is sufficient for consciousness, does not rely on any of these arguments. I think there are many other reasons to be suspicious of computation functionalism, which I find, frankly, much easier to understand and therefore more convincing. And I think they just make more sense to me. These are arguments based on things like the degenerative entrenchment of neural systems. You change one thing, it's dependent on everything. Computation typically involves a pretty sharp separation between hardware and software. It relies on things like immortal computation. You can take the same algorithm, run it on a different machine, it's going to run. There are just so many ways in which brains are different from computers. And taking these differences seriously, which means remembering that the brain is a computer, is a metaphor. It's a metaphor. Just remembering that and focusing a little bit on the differences, I think, tells us already to be quite suspicious of the idea of computational functionalism. That the things that motivate the computational view in terms of substrate flexibility just probably don't apply in things like brains. So my arguments in the recent preprint that I put out about a month ago and talk about this in length don't rely on like Gödel's theorem that Penrose originally wrote about in the late 1980s to argue against computation. There are many lines that go against it, but you don't need that one. But it's another line. Maybe it's right. I wonder about the idea of quantum computation. Is that a different kind of computationalism? I don't really know what that buys you to say that. I've not seen any particularly strong reasons why one needs to assume that the brain is involved in quantum computation, though maybe it is, let's see. And then these studies about anesthesia are very interesting, and it could well be, right? It could well be that to understand the mechanism of action of anesthesia, one needs to appeal to a quantum effect. This, of course, has happened before in biology. To understand photosynthesis, we need to appeal to quantum tunneling to understand the efficiency of photosynthesis. It doesn't mean that one's whole picture of the world is therefore overturned. It's just, it's true that the quantum physics is still our best explanation of that level of description in the world, and sometimes it's necessary. So my friend, colleague Nick Lane is talking about a lot of cool work about how anesthetic effects might take place in terms of disrupting chains of metabolism within mitochondria. And I don't think it really rests on microtubules. It's another hypothesis. I find it again, I'm quite attracted to this hypothesis. It may involve a quantum effect in terms of what's happening in these electron transport chains in mitochondria during cellular respiration. But it's not a foundation for a sort of whole theory of consciousness that is intrinsically quantum. It's just saying something about how anesthetics work. And that could be for very many reasons. Oh, and by the way, one other thing, and then I'll let you in, because you also mentioned the xenon gas anesthesia stuff, right? So this is also very intriguing, right? So is consciousness a quantum? Does it rely on a quantum property or not? So there was a paper from, I think, a Chinese group a while ago claiming that two different isotopes of xenon, which is an anesthetic, which is itself surprising because it's an inert gas. So what the hell is it doing anything much? But two different isotopes, which vary only in terms of spin, i.e. a quantum property, had differential anesthetic effects. Now, that was one paper. It has not been replicated. And there's another group in Santa Barbara trying to replicate this work. And if that replicates, that's great, because it would be very hard to explain that difference other than this quantum property of spin is somehow important. But again, even if it is, there are many potential reasons why that might be so. A Nick Lane type story about cellular respiration chains might involve spin in some way. So again, I don't think you can leap to the observation, if it turns out to be true, that a quantum effect is implicated in anesthesia, to saying that validates a theory based on orchestrated reduction or consciousness has to do with collapse of wave functions and so on. That's a very, very, very different kind of claim, which requires a very, very different kind of experiment. And those are not, to my knowledge, the kinds of experiments that are going on. Though the last thing I'll say is, again, I think the Santa Barbara group, again, is doing something like this, trying to look at this in some way. But I think it's very, very early days. And for me, the right attitude is not to reject out of hand the possibility that quantum mechanics has something to do with either just the raw mechanisms or is implicated in some deeper, more theoretically interesting way. But we shouldn't sort of leap straight from isolating some experimental effect to validating a theory.
No, but just getting back to certain sort of fundamentals, there's the principles of physics, and you mentioned in your book, John Wheeler, how do you go from it to bit, the whole that transit, and there is a sort of what and whether you believe in a physical realism or a information realism, that there are certain foundations, but we know from some Bell's inequality theorem, and we know in the replication of that, the axis of observation then brings in a collapse, and then you create a new state. We now got, we got quantum computers. We're going to have 1 million qubit quantum computers in the not too distant future. So there is something about and we seem to go in and out of a space-time quantum reality. And one of the things that I found really interesting in looking at these large language models and what was in studying and doing in semantics and things is that you have something like a quantum reference field, you have a tensor network in order to describe how to model the structure of human, mimic that knowledge. Not saying it's human, but it's like it captures a lot of the properties. And so it's where the things are like in different field states, and then they resolve into different kinds of propositions. It's all cloudy. I think there's something there. Exactly, my feeling. Or maybe you feel that that's a wrong turn, or
I think the thing is, I don't think it's a single turn. I think when the word quantum gets into the conversation, it tends to provoke very strong passions and emotions, and people often think of it as like, fully associated with sort of Penrose Hameroff, and they may be right. Let's see. I don't know. I think I'm always a bit suspicious about the microtubule story because microtubules are everywhere. But let's see. But the point, and I honestly mean that. I'd love to see their ideas be tested and see what happens. That's fine. But quantum can come into the story in many different ways. Just the mathematics of quantum mechanics can be useful at much higher levels of description in terms of like how human brains deal with probabilities that we often estimate probabilities that don't sum to one subjectively. So we can use those kind of mathematics without any claim that consciousness is intrinsically quantum. When you said about the observer effect, I think, for my money, one of the most beautiful stories in all of science has been the story of the testing of the Bell inequality, and the ruling out of one interpretation of quantum mechanics, which was the hidden variable interpretation. It just was so hard to do this, but that it was done, and then the closing of the loopholes over successive years to the extent of taking sources of the different photons from different sides of the universe. I mean, it's just astonishing. I love it, and it was such a well-deserved Nobel Prize in physics. But the whole entanglement thing, it's very strange. It's very interesting. There's an ongoing discussion about whether these phenomena can operate or play any kind of functional role in things like warm, wet brains. People ruled it out. Maybe they don't rule it out quite so much now. But it doesn't warrant, the Bell inequality thing doesn't say anything about observers per se, because no one's really defined what an observer is. So in certain kinds of interactions between the small and the large collapse wave functions. But that's very different from saying it's a observer or let alone a conscious observer that matters. And I think that's one of the outstanding challenges and problems still.
Well, I mean, this goes back to a larger the discussion we're thinking is that the traditional notion of science as constructed, say, from the Enlightenment, was that you have the objective observer. You have a third-party observer. And that you're able then to have distance yourself from and then render a impartial understanding of something that can be replicated. But we now know that the observer and the observer are mutually constructed, embedded in one another. There isn't that posture, that place that you can stand with a full objectivity. That's my inference from this. Maybe you disagree with that or modify that, but it seems that, and so you get a lot of discussions, say with Michael Levin and Carl and other people saying, "Oh, okay, from what perspective are you looking at from inside out?" It's sort of like third person, first person, second part. You have, what pronoun am I really working with on this? And then you have this idea of fundamental consciousness, of whether it isn't all one, but many things willing together. It strikes me as that's not resolved in some way or not. I mean, I think these are open methodological questions.
I think they're open questions in many ways. I also think, again, the importance is separating out some of those issues. So the problem of how one deals with the observability of a system enters into consciousness research in more than one way. It enters in a very obvious way by the nature by which we know about consciousness, which is from the first person. Conscious experiences are by their nature intrinsic, private, and usually, but not always, subjective in terms of feels like there's that we are a subject experiencing things. So the data are not shareable in the same way that, if I have a frog on a table or I'm looking down a telescope, the data is shareable. But I think that's a problem that we would face whatever physical framework we have. And I don't think simply appealing to, to say that in quantum mechanics the observer becomes inseparable from the process is a different kind of problem from the problem of not being able to third person observe a first person experience. They're not the same problems. They may be related. There's another very interesting experimental challenge, which there's another interpretation of quantum mechanics which is out there, which is the von Neumann-Wigner interpretation, which is the idea that it is consciousness that collapses the wave function. The observation is the conscious observer. Yeah, and most people, to my knowledge, don't really pay this interpretation much attention. But it's also potentially testable. It may not be easy, but you can imagine setups that actually modulate the conscious status of an observation and see, in some generalization of a double slit experiment, whether that makes a difference. You have to do a lot of matching of timescales, which is very hard. But my colleagues Adam Barrett and Yaya Pinto have been thinking about this and how to do it. And other groups have as well. So I think that there may be stuff there. It's one of those experiments that's a bit like the xenon thing. If we're able to do it, I very much doubt it would actually show a difference. But if it did, it would be very interesting, right? So sometimes it's worth doing these high risk, high gain experiments. But you can still do them. I mean, this is the whole point, I think, about consciousness science. It was written off for so long just by this attitude that you can't do experiments on something as seemingly immaterial, subjective as consciousness. But of course you can. And you just have to be mindful of the limits of the claims that you base on those experiments.
So this is what you mean by your piecemeal, piece-by-piece approach, is breaking it down to different components and then being able to test it. Is that?
That's right. Yeah. I mean, yeah. But it wasn't just me. It was Crick and Crick and Koch back in the early '90s with their neural correlates. That point there wasn't much in the way of explanation, but it was. I think historically very important in just saying, look, you can do experiments on consciousness. It is possible. It does make sense. We just have to be careful about the methods and about the claims made.
I mean, are you seeing any form of computational, any work in terms of building computational agents that interest you? I mean, so you have active inference. There's a whole group that Bert de Vries's group, I don't know if you're familiar with Eindhoven, RX and Fur, and the kind of things that they're doing. There are people that are cobbling together. Is there any particular direction that you think is particularly promising, or in that? And it's moving away from these large language models. It's moving away from this sort of batch processing notion to what you're trying to give some sense of internal representation. It has, it's an embodiment a lot of Carl's ideas. And have you seen stuff there that you think is promising or would be good things to experiments to run? For our audience, we have people who are researchers and we're affiliated with the Active Inference Institute, and they're saying, okay, well, what would be, what's the X prize here?
We've actually thought about that specifically, saying, what would be an X prize? And the problem with an X prize is that X prizes work when the criteria for success may be very ambitious, but are also very clear. Sending a human to, paying tour to space, whatever it might be, build, whatever it is. But everyone, you want to have something that everyone will agree that you did it. And in consciousness, we don't have that, right? There is just no way in my mind to establish a criterion that everyone will say, yeah, you did it. So it's not that kind of thing yet, which is a shame because that would itself be progress. Getting to the stage where you could even think about doing an X Prize for consciousness, I think would be a remarkable progress. And that, that's something useful to think about. What would that take? Now, in terms of these models that are out there, of course, language models are the things everyone is paying attention to, along with generative visual models and generative perceptual models and so on. But of course, AI has been going on for long before that and is much different from that, and it's doing all kinds of things. And the other thing, as you just mentioned, that language models lack is embodiment, or at least currently, but that is an easily solvable problem. And I think there's a lot of interesting things happening in embodied AI, in neuromorphic AI. And these can be for all sorts of reasons. Neuromorphic AI may help us address the insane energetic costs, computational energetic costs that machine learning is imposing on the planet. It's so inefficient. It's ridiculous. And brains aren't that inefficient. So there's a big moral problem here. When you enter a search into Google and you press enter, and then you enter the same search into GPT, you press enter. From the user's perspective, it feels the same, though you get a different answer. But the amount of energy that has been required to give you the two answers is so vastly different. So we have a psychological problem here where people are not understanding the environmental impact of the use of these kinds of AI. And of course, for generative visual models, it's even worse. So that's one reason why these kinds of approaches bear promise. And I think that will probably be the main driver. So, people doing neuromorphic AI are not trying to build something that's conscious. They're trying to make more energy efficient algorithms.
That's very so. That's really interesting. I mean,
it raises this. Sorry, I keep interrupting you, but it raises this large. It raises this larger point, which I think is also critical. That this, in many ways, the whole debate about whether AI can be conscious is a huge distraction because nobody knows.
Right.
It's worth worrying about a little bit because its consequences, were it to happen, would be very bad. And I'm not talking here about Terminator scenarios where conscious AIs decide to destroy us all, but we will have brought into the universe things which have moral considerability, and that is a huge problem. We would not, we don't want to precipitate an ethical catastrophe by bringing into existence lots of conscious things without having really thought about how and why we're doing it. But we don't know. I mean, nobody knows about this, and the extent people argue about it distracts us from exactly this kind of issue. The energy costs, but also AI that seems conscious and its potential to influence us, how we can be taken in by deep fakes, how our emotions can be manipulated by language models that tell us to do things, and we feel they're conscious even though they're not. There are so many ethical issues here and now that I think get unusefully mixed up with these big existential uncertain concerns.
Well, let me throw a little wild card here. So I don't know, David Silverswig? David is a neuroscientist at Harvard Medical School. He's just a former dean and runs it. But anyway, he's an MD and a psychiatrist. And actually, he's worked with Carl and others. And we're looking at sort of this notion of AI governance, and rather than seeing it as an externality, sort of a whack-a-mole approach, is that how you can build in certain principles. I mean, it can. I'm hesitating, as you say, on saying giving it a conscience of some kind. In other words, it has internal constraints, and as a living thing, it will not violate those internal constraints. And so, but you see what in other words, there are certain fundamental things that the simple analogy might be the idea of the analogy I give. We've domesticated the dog. We can create certain breeds of dogs that don't do certain things, and they do other certain things. It's just inherent in the breed, in the character of what they are, and so it's not even considered. It's not even they're not. It's by their definition of what they are. They do certain things, and they can explicate it. They know when they're doing something, so they're self-aware in some side. Because if you try to govern things through after the fact, it's just going to be one ad hoc thing after another. But is there a principled way in which you can have something that does not even consider in its space except a certain kind of outcomes? Or do you think that's a fool's errand?
Well, I'd like to hope not. I think it's very important. I mean, the approach I have heard about, it's definitely out of my wheelhouse, is constitutional AI, where you you basically have part of the model, part of the system, which encodes a set of constraints that will constrain whatever output the system is generating, and a way of enforcing, guaranteeing that those constraints are being followed. So this can do certain things like, make sure that outputs follow some laws, some human laws that we might want to prescribe. I think those kinds of systems, it's still, the idea is it would still be intrinsic to the system in that it just would do it. It would impose those constraints, but it would also be the kind of system for which you can imagine an alternative system that would still work, but would be freed from those constraints if you turn the constitution model off. And I think what you're talking about is something fundamental where, in fact, you cannot sort of separate out the constraints that guarantee socially positive behavior from the thing that it actually is. And that, I don't know, but it sounds like an interesting approach.
Okay, well, good. I appreciate that. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk these things over with us. Is there anything else that you want to say or get out that you feel is important that wasn't covered here?
I mean, we certainly covered a lot of terrain. I mean, I think I would just want to return to where we currently are and in consciousness research, and we have these very different theoretical perspectives. We have things like IIT, which is a very rich and interesting framework now, and it does generate some testable predictions. It's not yet testable as a whole, but it does generate testable predictions. But if we read it in the Giulio Tononi sense, it makes some pretty dramatic claims about the nature of the universe, and it's a fairly discrete framework, and as well, rather than a continuous framework. But there are many ways to think about things like IIT. So I think my overall message is that whenever there's a distinction between a strong approach that tries to solve the big problem head on, and there are often also weaker versions, and the weaker versions are often always more powerful in the end. Mark Granovetter wrote this wonderful paper years and years ago in sociology called The Strength of Weak Ties. The weak coupling between networks, that's where the action is. Now, it's not exactly the same thing, but in every domain, strong AI, is a system actually intelligent? Well, it becomes almost unanswerable, and you're better off thinking in terms of weak AI. What can we do with systems that that implement some of the functional properties? Artificial life, where I did my PhD, strong versus weak, alive. Is it really alive? Or, is it just implementing, realizing some of the, so we can understand life better? Emergence, another thing. We do a lot of work on emergence in my group. Is it emergent in the sense of really being sui generis and something completely irreducible? No, there are weaker ways to look at it too. A flock of birds really is more than the sum of its parts, really does constrain the behavior of birds within it without contradicting supervenience or anything. And we can define mathematical measures like this. Integrated information is a measure of emergence in some ways. That's kind of the way that I tend to orient myself when thinking about any of these problems. What is a way we can operationalize something? What is a way we can apply it? What is a way we can capture some of the motivating features, even if we have to set aside the grand claim of isolating it, because I think that can mislead us more often than it can inform us.
Is there anything you see that is a competitive to the integrated information theory that has that kind of, that is a competitor to that, or is that sort of the main?
Well, I think that's the main example I come up with, because not because it's the dominant theory of consciousness. I think it's one of the most prominent, but it's because it has this. It's because this distinction between the weak and the strong version is pretty clear in the context of IIT. There is a strong version, which is a sufficiency condition for consciousness. It makes it relies on saying that consciousness just is irreducible maxima of integrated information. And it becomes very difficult to test for that reason. Whereas weaker versions just make a weaker claim that measures of complexity in some form have this explanatory link between dynamics and phenomenology, and can be measured more easily because they drop the bigger claim.
So you can cascade those weaker claims into a bigger claim in some sense. They're building blocks.
They can be. So it may be that, enough interesting stuff happening when you take these concepts in the weak sense may lead you to try and think, well, how do we, maybe, there are two outcomes. One outcome is that actually you realize the hard sense idea is not really necessary anymore. It's not doing any extra work. Or maybe it is, and you find a way to test it. So, in emergence in general, maybe thinking of emergence from this weak sense of characterizing in all these different ways. After you do that, you may think, hold on a minute, there's nothing like this idea that you can have strong emergence is actually totally unnecessary now. And just to bring us back right to the beginning, that's my working hypothesis of consciousness itself. This is the hard problem, real problem distinction. That you've got this hard problem of consciousness. How does it relate to matter? So instead of addressing it head on, let's just explain, predict, control its properties. That's the kind of weak sense approach to consciousness science. And let's do what we can with the tools that we have, but try to make explanatory progress. And maybe, it's too early to tell, but maybe when we do that, we'll either have tools to address the residual hard problem, or we'll think, well, they don't need that. We have no need for that that distinction or that concept anymore.
Very good.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I enjoyed that greatly.